several of the things that we know are happening as far as God's day of judgment. We know that the Bible tells us that all inhabitants of the earth are the object of the wrath of God. For example, if we turn to Revelation chapter 8, verse 13, and Revelation 8 is a chapter that is describing the wrath of God, the judgment that did fall on the corporate church, that judgment which began at the house of God. Verse 13 is the last verse of that chapter, transitioning to the next chapter, as chapter 8 was talking about the first 4 trumpets and the judgment on the church. Revelation 8:13, that transition verse, speaks of 3 woes. The 3 woes are the last 3 trumpets that will bring the wrath of God on the world. So it is really a transition, and therefore it identifies with May 21, 2011, because that day completed the Great Tribulation, the judgment on the church, and transitioned to the judgment on the world. And so here in Revelation 8:13 it says, "And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound." And then chapter 9, the 5th angel sounded. That's the first woe. And the 6th angel will be the 2nd, the 7th angel the 3rd. And as we've discussed before, the 3 woes, the last 3 trumpets, sound simultaneously, just as the first 4 trumpets sounded simultaneously. Each one was simply describing the judgment on the churches. And it wasn't, as some would try to make it, they want to make it chronological. And that's not how God laid out the first 4 trumpets. No, it's just describing the 23-year Great Tribulation period. And likewise, the last 3 woes, the 3 woes are not to be broken down into some time sequence, chronological order. No, all 3 of them are focused on May 21, 2011, Judgment Day, and the prolonged judgment that follows, which biblical evidence is indicating will continue until 2033, the Second Tribulation. As tribulation is a synonym for judgment, the first tribulation, called the Great Tribulation, was the judgment on the church, followed by this period of tribulation, which is the judgment on the world. Well, here God very clearly says, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. And this kind of language is found elsewhere. If we go to Isaiah 24, Isaiah chapter 24 is a chapter that is describing the wrath of God falling on the people of the earth. Let's begin reading verse 1. Behold, Jehovah maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. And then in verse 3, the land, and that's the same word that was translated as earth in the first verse, the land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for Jehovah has spoken this word. The earth mourneth and fadeth away. The world languisheth and fadeth away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men left. And we've talked about that verse often. The inhabitants of the earth are burned. Not literally, because it's a spiritual judgment for the most part, and to be burned just indicates they're under the wrath of God. Their eternal fate has been sealed and they're destroyed. It's just a matter of the working out of the destruction. Once God shut the door of heaven and ended his salvation program, the filthy remain filthy, and their condition cannot change. They cannot escape the wrath of God. They will be destroyed. So they are as burned, yet few men left. And the Bible tells us many are called, few are chosen. The few are the elect left on the earth to go through the judgment. And we won't spend too much time on this, but there's numerous verses that teach this. We could go to Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9, And it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith Jehovah. Now the word land is this same Hebrew word. It's Strong's number 776 that is translated as earth several times in Isaiah 24. Actually, this Hebrew word, 776 in Strong's Concordance, is translated as earth over 700 times in the Old Testament. So it's not trying to make it say what we want it to say. It is a word that does mean earth and is often translated that way. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, this particular Hebrew word. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So in Zechariah 13:8, it shall come to pass that in all the land, all the earth, saith Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. This reference to 2 parts ties in with point 666. 2/3, that figure that is given in the book of Revelation, which is the number of man who is under the wrath of God. And the third part would be God's elect. And that's why the elect were in the churches over the course of the church age. That's where you would find the third part. And so when we get to Revelation chapter 8, and it tells us judgment is on the third part of this and the third part of that, it's indicating God's judgment is on the churches where the third part were found for the last 2,000 years, so the church age. And so it's a figure that identifies with the few. Just as Isaiah 24:6 says, the inhabitants of the earth are burned and few men left. So here too, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die. That's the inhabitants of the earth. But the third shall be left therein. And I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people. And they shall say, Jehovah is my God. Now this cannot possibly be the church that's in view, because it says the third part shall be left therein. What do we know about God's judgment on the church? Yes, he targeted the unsaved, and we could say that the 2 parts who identify with the unsaved within the church. And he poured out his wrath, and they were cut off and died. But did he leave the third part in the churches? No. No, he commanded his elect to come out of the churches, depart out of the midst, flee to the mountains. It's not possible, therefore, for these 2 verses to refer to God's judgment on the church. It can only refer to God's judgment on the world. And by the way, some people who see God's judgment on the church everywhere they look, it's like God never wrote about judging the inhabitants of the earth, of judging the world. And these are just a handful of people that came out of the churches. They still recognize God's judgment is on the church. They like that idea. And they're outside of the church, and so they like pointing over there. Yeah, it's over there. Every verse that may touch them and their family, their location, and there goes the finger. It's over there on the church. And that's how they go through the Bible, and it's a convenient way to try and avoid and escape the judgment of God. It's always over there, so I don't have to worry about my family. Yet that's just as wrong as any other erroneous doctrine, and especially at this time, because we have to face facts. We have to realize that the Bible locked in May 21, 2011 as Judgment Day. It will not move from that position. Regarding the Second Tribulation, God's wrath is on the world.